Four senators who are running for president are working to engage voters despite taking time off of the campaign trail for the impeachment trial. The Iowa caucuses and New Hampshire primary are quickly approaching, and those Democrats now face some questions about how the proceedings will impact their efforts on the ground in those states. So here's how one of those candidates, Senator Elizabeth Warren, addressed the issue earlier.
I have made a commitment and I will be here. I am, however, very happy to see that grassroots organization that I've been trying to develop for over a year now has really sprung into action.
Do you think you can do what you need to do to win in Iowa? Only going there maybe 2-3 times ahead of the caucus because of this trial?
All I can do is my best. I have a responsibility to be here, and I will be here.
All right, so let's bring in Caitlin Huey-Burns, Leslie Sanchez, and Joel Payne. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter. Leslie is a CBS News political contributor and Republican strategist. Joel is a CBSN political contributor, a Democratic strategist, and former Senate leadership aide. So, Caitlin, let's start with you. How are the candidates advancing their campaigns in those key early states, even though they're in Washington, D.C., tied up in this impeachment trial?
Yeah, this is the trial versus the trail. These are candidates that very much would rather be in Iowa, unlike a lot of us who don't want to be there in the cold, but they do. This is like the precious time before the caucuses on Monday. We'll just be 1 week away from the caucuses. But you see there Elizabeth Warren, who, when I covered her in the Senate, when she was just a senator, not a presidential candidate, rarely stopped for interviews, as Joel knows. Now you see her all over your TV screens. We've seen her a lot on TV in this newsroom. Same with Amy Klobuchar. They're trying to get that FaceTime. They're phoning in or appearing via satellite to local affiliates in Iowa, trying to very much stay as relevant as possible, especially because they know that impeachment is all over the airwaves. And so they're trying to do that. Meanwhile, you have candidates like Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden who are running around Iowa without much competition, and they're kind of able to also distance themselves from Washington, which could be a benefit for those Iowa voters who may be kind of tired of all of this divisiveness.
Well, Buttigieg definitely, but Biden, his name is being brought up quite a lot in the impeachment trial.
Yes, that's true.
We shall see about him. So, Joel, let me ask you, does that strategy work of using the media for candidates like Sanders and Warren, or is this really a huge advantage to Buttigieg and Biden because they get to be on the ground in Iowa?
Well, it's undoubtedly an advantage. You know, you're less than 14 days or so away from the caucuses, and you've got these two candidates that have access to voters, have access to local media without, you know, these other four candidates on the trail. What I think is interesting, though, here is that two things jump to mind in terms of what is going to really help stabilize these folks as they're not there in Iowa. One, their organization on the ground. People like Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders have invested so much. Bernie Sanders' organization goes back 5 or 6 years. So that's one thing. The second thing, surrogates. I look at who people have in the field that can speak for them. So Elizabeth Warren has Julian Castro, who's a big-time surrogate. Bernie Sanders has folks like AOC, a lot of state legislators back in Iowa. Amy Klobuchar, you know, she boasts the same thing. So think about those types of elements when you're trying to figure out how do you make up for not being in market. You've got some other elements there that can really help you, you know, bridge the divide when you're not able to speak to voters and interface with them, you know, yourself.
And on the other side of things, Leslie, this question is for you. How is the president's campaign being impacted by the impeachment trial?
The president's in full force. Not only is it at the Republican National Committee winter meeting, you know, basically gathering support from the party base, talking about fundraising, talking about strong economy, talking about, you know, everything they're going to need to move forward to 2020. But he's also in these competitive states like Florida, up in the Midwest, having big, strong rallies, and basically taking on his personal defense on impeachment, either through Twitter or personally, and in these long kind of diatribes in the way he does. But it's very effective. And in many cases, you're seeing a lot of pushback, a lot of voters who feel that the president's not being treated fairly, meaning his base. And they're even more, there's more of a sense of urgency to get out there, to organize, and to support the president because he's under attack.
I think something that's maybe a little bit undertold here, too, is the type of voters that impeachment might bring out. we're so close to these caucuses and these primaries. So is that going to drive up progressive turnout by those voters who might be, engaged by this type of a spectacle in Washington, D.C.? I think that's something that we'll probably see in those exit polls. Caitlin, you're probably seeing those things from your reporting on the ground as well.
And what you've said on the ground is that people don't care that much about impeachment. They care about other issues.
Exactly. They're really not asking these candidates about it. They are certainly engaged in watching it, but they're not asking about it. It's not something they think it's going to be a foregone conclusion anyway, and they want to kind of litigate this at the ballot box. But it also, to Joel's point, does create this sense of urgency of, if President Trump is exonerated by the Senate as we expect him to be, does that motivate Republicans even further? And that's what Democrats are really trying to grapple with as well, and kind of get those ground games in motion and make that clear to their supporters.
It's really interesting, too. I mean, if you go around the country, whether you look at the rallies, or I was just in Southern Virginia, you're seeing a lot of these kind of pop-up Trump country kind of gatherings, and they are individuals who are waving the American flag, have their Trump, paraphernalia, just to sell, and kind of communities to share, whether they're gun owners or whatever the issue may be, but coming together because they feel that this is just, that what is happening in the Senate is fundamentally not right. Whether you like the president or not, to be able to remove a sitting president like that on something that's so subjective in their opinion is really a call to arms for many of these individuals. So I think it's activating in a way that both the Trump campaign management has talked about, and also the way you're seeing in the terms of the dollars that are being raised.
And let's switch gears here a little bit and talk about the candidate of Mike Bloomberg. Earlier this week, Caitlin, you reported that he had a huge ad buy for an ad about impeachment. Now he's released a new ad attacking President Trump's treatment of members of the military. So what is his strategy there?
Well, what I find so interesting about Mike Bloomberg is that he is going straight to Trump. We have not seen him engage his other rivals at all. On one hand, he's not competing in Iowa. He's competing for the Super Tuesday states and beyond, and plans to at least have an operation running through the general election to help whoever is the nominee, though he hopes it's himself. And he's starting to really get under the president's skin, at least according to the campaign and according to President Trump's tweets. He's been calling him Mini Mike. He has a nickname, which means he's getting some attention by the president. These are two New Yorkers who have operated in New York for a long time, have very little in common, and this is a fight that seems very personal for the both of them. But Mike Bloomberg, with these ads, getting in on impeachment, getting in on national security, is trying to, again, be relevant in the conversation, but really focusing on Trump. And that's why you don't see a ton of Democrats really, at least at this point, completely aggravated by him being in the race.
The interesting part about Mike Bloomberg's strategy is he's not saying, these are all the things I've done, look at my accomplishments, I went and started, self-made, did all these things. Instead, he's taking the battle directly to the president on those particular issues to increase the negatives. So if anything, that's the positive that you're seeing in there. When you can have an entity that's just driving negatives at a time when everybody else is trying to figure out who's going to be the head of the primary, it does have the counterbalance effect.
I do think it's going to, I was going to say, I do think it's going to be somewhat of a crisis of conscience for some Democratic primary voters, because Bloomberg is dumping so much money into the race, which is obviously helpful to the overall Democratic effort to defeat Donald Trump. But I think a lot of Democrats do feel a little bit uneasy about the idea of now not just one, but two billionaires dropping all this money into a primary where you had candidates like Kamala Harris and Cory Booker, who were essentially driven out of the race because they couldn't afford to keep up. And so I do think that there is going to be this soul searching within the Democratic Party about how comfortable they are with having Mike Bloomberg or Tom Steyer put their finger on the scales with so much money, given the fact that historically the Democratic Party tends to like to distance himself from things like that. That'll be interesting to watch play out over the next couple weeks as well.
And especially as he's rising in national polls and Steyer has beat out other competition for the debate. That's certainly something to watch.
So not only do they have the money problem in terms of the elitist kind of perception of which the Democrats have railed against, but they also have the political problem of the Bernie Sanders types who are so progressive, pulling the entire party to the left. Where does that leave the centrist? So it's ideologically and it's obviously financially.
Well, do you think that some vulnerable Republican senators like Cory Gardner or Susan Collins, should they be concerned about Bloomberg and his ad buys and his attacks on President Trump?
In some of those areas, not particularly. I mean, the thing that happens in a presidential year, and it's too soon to tell, but the amount of people, so what we know is you expect a lot more people to turn out for an election like this. So it's going to drive up turnout, and I don't imagine you're going to see a lot of split ticket. If they vote Republican, top of the ticket, you're going to get that support all the way down. That's what you didn't see in the midterms. So this changes the math in terms of how that's going to affect a lot of those individuals in the swing states.
So looking forward to New Hampshire, we know that the Trump campaign has announced the president will be holding a rally there on February 10th, the day before the primary is taking place. So what is the president's strategy for being in New Hampshire?
Well, he is going to be in Iowa right before the caucuses, New Hampshire, as voters are weighing in there. He's trailing all of these candidates. We know that there is not a competitive Republican primary at all. He really doesn't have much competition. So this is a way for the Trump campaign to be kind of where the attention is. And this is something that Democrats know they're going to have to grapple with. And that's why you hear a lot of Democrats in their closing arguments talking about this issue of electability. Right? It's not really talking about issues that are dividing the party. Instead, they're all trying to make their closing arguments about, I'm the best person to take on Donald Trump, and here's why.
So you think he's there in a very blue state purely for the press and to have... to show his face.
It'll be interesting to see, Brad Parscale, the Trump campaign manager, was on CBS this morning earlier this week, and he was asked about some of these competitors, and they like to say that they'd be able to beat anybody, but he also brought up Bernie Sanders as someone who might be underestimated by the Democratic Party, and we know that Bernie Sanders is either leading or, in a close race in a lot of these states. He did very well in the New Hampshire primary, appealing to those working class voters that Trump also appeals to. So could be an interesting battle.
So maybe the scheduled rallies because Trump is feeling a little threatened by Sanders.
Right, and they appeal to the same type of voter for different reasons. I mean, in terms of the independent voter, in some cases more it's independent conservative, but people that also where the economy being stronger in New Hampshire is going to have an impact. It's interesting to see where they're going to go.
And he almost won New Hampshire.
I think it's worth reminding folks, too, that New Hampshire is so unpredictable off the heels of Iowa. I worked in New Hampshire a decade and a half ago for John Edwards when Hillary Clinton staged her comeback against Barack Obama. And what made that so interesting was that the polling didn't pick that up. People like me who are on the ground saw the energy for Clinton, but that was not picked up in the polling. And I do think that that's something that's important as we're thinking about this and we're litigating this on television and, we're contemplating how, voters in New Hampshire are going to react. New Hampshire likes to go left when some of us are going right. That's historically something that's happened both on the Democratic and the Republican side. I'd watch out for that.
All right, time will tell. Caitlin Huey-Burns, Leslie Sanchez, and Joel Payne, thank you so much for being here.